Hey, it's Dr. K. I'm a California licensed naturopathic doctor and certified sacred medicine woman. Welcome to the Divine Woman Wellness Podcast. This is a show about whole body wellness that is going to support you in finding alignment with your body, mind, and spirit. I believe every woman should have a deeper understanding of her body and soul, and my mission on this show is to guide you through learning about your body, how you can shift your day-to-day life to support health and wellness while connecting to yourself on a deeper level. These episodes are rooted in naturopathic medicine, vitalism, biohacking, and mysticism, and will guide you towards well-being in body, mind, and soul. Thank you for being here. Let's dive in. Okay, welcome, my loves, to another episode of the Divine Woman Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kapersky, and today I think we're going to talk about time-restricted feeding and intermittent fasting and clear up some of those myths and, get some clarification on that topic, because I have so many of my patients that are either doing time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting, and there are a lot of misnomers. And so I'm unfortunately seeing a lot of negative health effects with these dietary approaches. And well, let's dive in a little bit deeper, because as women, we're complicated in the best of ways. We just have more hormones that we need to actually take into consideration in relationship to our time-restricted feeding and intermittent fasting approaches. So first, why do I keep saying both of these like there's something different? So intermittent fasting is actually an approach where we skip a day or two of food intake. That's actually considered intermittent fasting. Time-restricted feeding, on the other hand, is actually when we're eating within a certain window of time within a day and not during other parts of the day. So I know in pop culture it is looked at mostly as intermittent fasting. We have a lot of skipping breakfast, eating one meal a day. Technically, that is time-restricted feeding, not intermittent fasting. A true intermittent fast would be skipping food 2 days a week out of 7, or skipping, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Those are intermittent fasting periods. So, couple of things. In regards to our hormones, so as women throughout our cycle, our blood sugar is actually affected by our hormonal balances. And so I think it's really important to take this into consideration when we're participating in these dietary restrictions or dietary modifications. And I know a lot of us are trying to utilize them in order to lower inflammation and to improve our longevity. So let's make sure we're doing it the right way. Intermittent fasting is where we skip days within a week. And I think for a lot of my patients, at least, a lot of people that are struggling with adrenals that are less than optimal, women with hormonal changes, either perimenopause or even just cycle length differences while we're still menstruating, just not quite our time for transition yet, we want to be really, really mindful of what we're doing with our body. So again, it is really important for us to take our hormones into consideration. There are periods within our menstrual cycle where it is more advisable to make these dietary changes and maybe even caloric restriction. And then there are other times where it's less advisable. So let's talk about that first. Actually, let's back up before we talk about that. So I mentioned intermittent fasting, and I do think it's really important to be clear that when I say intermittent fasting here, I mean skipping days within the week where we're not taking in any food. And that has its own dietary anti-inflammatory benefits. This conversation is mostly going to focus on time-restricted eating or time-restricted feeding, depending on which way you look at it. So, because I think that's really what most people are doing, there are fewer people that are truly skipping entire days. So, taking that into consideration now, I want to highlight within the menstrual cycle, when do we have to be more careful about these restrictive types of interventions. And this doesn't mean necessarily even a caloric restriction or a nutrient restriction, but the time restriction sometimes can add stress. And when we are restricting our food intake to a very narrow window, that may actually create a physiological stress that signals to our bodies that we are not having enough nutrients to our body. And if we're having blood sugar dysregulation, our blood sugar's dropping way too low, that's actually going to cause cortisol to be released so that the liver releases more glucose into the bloodstream. But the body is perceiving the cortisol as, oh my goodness, there's a tiger and it's chasing us. So not so great for our adrenals and our hormones, which again are very intricately connected. And maybe that'll be an episode in the future where I can talk about the intricacies of the blood sugar regulation throughout the menstrual cycle, because I think it's really important to understand those nuances, especially if you're tracking your glucose levels. So, benefits of intermittent fasting and time-restricted feeding both include autophagy, and autophagy is a process in which the body reabsorbs or eats, autophagy, self-eating essentially, which sounds much better when we say autophagy, a little less brutal. So autophagy is a really beneficial process in which we take cells that are malfunctioning or no longer functioning at their prime, and we're reabsorbing them, and then we can reutilize these building blocks and create new cells with that. And it's really important. It's just like cleaning your house, right? We want to vacuum, we want to dust, we want to take out the trash. Think of autophagy as these maintenance habits that if we don't do them, they build up over time and then eventually cause problems or a really gross home. So please make sure you do your weekly chores, and we can support the body with autophagy. So both intermittent fasting and time-restricted feeding accomplish or get your body into a place of autophagy. The longer the fast, the more autophagy your body will experience at one time. And this is where people have these profound improvements in inflammation, where we're not eating for 1 to 3 days, we're maybe on a water fast or a juice cleanse, something like that, and our inflammation drops way down. We're recycling a lot of these broken down pieces in our body, or those pieces that are not contributing well, and we really actually go after a lot of the white blood cells. So this is really important in autoimmune conditions. We lower the aberrant immune cells, and so that can help reestablish a more healthy balance. So again, the longer we fast, the more autophagy we have. Now we can get to a point where we get into true catabolism and we're breaking down healthy tissues. And that is the difference between autophagy and catabolism. Catabolism is breaking down, opposite of anabolism. Like anabolic steroids are building steroids. They build up, bulk up muscles. Catabolic is to break apart. Okay, back to autophagy. So it's important to have this housekeeping on a regular interval within our body. Now, when does autophagy truly start to occur within the body, within the cells? Autophagy starts, you start having benefits at the 12-hour mark. For each additional hour after that, you have additional benefits. So you have more autophagy. It's just like for every hour extra that you spend cleaning your house is going to get cleaner. The longer we do fasting, the more we clean out cells that are no longer helpful to the body. So there also comes a point in time where we shift into that catabolism and we start breaking down healthy tissues. And then we have that nuance of at what point in time is the fasting creating stress within the body that's actually then shifting our hormone signaling, stressing our adrenal glands. We've talked quite a bit about how much stress negatively affects our hormones in the previous episodes. If you haven't listened to them yet, please make sure you go ahead and give them a listen so you have a better understanding of why stress is important or why reducing stress is so important. 60% of our calories right now in the United States, unfortunately, comes from ultra-processed foods. That's a lot. Over 75% of Americans are suffering from obesity or diagnosed with obesity. And obesity strains the immune system. We know this. Obesity strains all of our systems. It adds extra pressure. Now, this is an episode about weight loss, although weight improvement can be a side effect of time restricted feeding as well as intermittent fasting. Now, when we have extra weight, especially the fatty cells around, the midsection, they can release extra hormones. We see this in men, this, what we call the beer belly, releases estrogen. Right? So then we have extra estrogens in our system. So it's really important for female hormones, especially if you're estrogen dominant. If you have weight that is in the midsection, that may be contributing to it. So it may not actually be your hormones, but then it becomes this feed forward cycle. So I digress. Now, because most of our food comes from this ultra processed, highly processed food source here in the United States, we also have very little nutrient density in our dietary intake, which is something that is very important to take into consideration when we're having this intermittent fasting, time restricted feeding approach, because we want to make sure we're getting all of our nutrients in. And even if we're not applying these techniques, we still want to make sure and get our micronutrients in. So let's all, whether you choose to do intermittent fasting, time restricted feeding, whatever your choice is in your dietary intervention, make sure you're choosing high quality, nutrient dense foods. Something I want to point out is that fasting has been part of many, many traditions, ancient cultures. This is how a lot of illnesses were treated in the past were actually with fasts. And it's really interesting, and there's so many different ways to fast, but we as a human culture collective have known that fasting can have health benefits. We didn't understand the mechanisms necessarily. However, we understood the health benefits. Nowadays, fasting is definitely something we do, yes, in terms of diet yo-yo culture, which we're not doing in healthy ways because we're doing starvation diets and we're doing them way too long. We're not doing controlled fasting or time restricted feeding, which has therapeutic approaches. But I definitely do think that it's interesting that most, if not all, major religions actually include fasting in their sacred practices. And yes, it's cleansing the spirit, but it's also cleansing the body. And when you cleanse the body, you cleanse the spirit is the philosophy behind there. And now we're starting to have a lot more research on benefits of fasting in regards to longevity and just lifespan, but also quality of life, right? When we lower inflammation and toxic insults by fasting, then we have better, we live longer, we feel better while we're alive. And that's really a goal, is to not just live longer, but live well. Fasting supports metabolic health, cellular function, cellular cleanup, cellular regeneration, including of circulating stem cells. So when we do intermittent fasting, probably more so than just a time-restricted feeding, but we can actually increase the circulating stem cells, which are the precursors then to cells, to regenerating cells and tissues that may have been damaged through whatever instances of life that we've come across. Intermittent fasting has been shown to impact markers with increase in longevity and health span, as I've already mentioned. And it's just incredible to look at the evolution where we started with fasting as a medicinal approach and a sacred approach, and we went through modern medicine, and we have this culture of excess food intake, and we've developed a lot of diseases and illnesses of excess. And now we're very much starting to incorporate fasting, time-restricted feeding in more of a healthy, balanced way. I think more along the lines of like the 80-20 rule, which I think is really important to adhere to when it comes to our health. Because if we're trying to do something 100%, as noble as that is, it can actually cause negative health effects in the long run when we're stressing ourselves out about eating just the right way and getting just the right nutrients and being so perfect, and then it makes life a lot less fun. And I think life really is meant to be enjoyed and lived to the fullest. So another really interesting point is that about 80% of our immune cells actually are in our gut. Most of our immune system is in our gut. And our epithelial cells, our skin cells, our gut cells actually regrow over 5 to 7 days, which is pretty fascinating, right? Now, it does take about 3 months for your gut lining to fully restore and fully turn over and heal because, it takes time for everything to regenerate and there's a lot of cells. But on average, endothelial function, epithelial cells, your enterocytes, your gut cells, they regenerate over the course of a week. Now, I would not fast somebody for a week unless they're going to somewhere like True North, which is dedicated to fasting, and they're in a controlled environment and they're having their vitals checked, and there's doctors around making sure this is a medically supervised fast. There are many different types of fasting, as we've already talked. There's the time-restricted eating or feeding. There's intermittent fasting. And then the prolonged fasting is something that I just brought up, which is fasting over 4 days. And fasting, it's very interesting. So fasting actually does ramp up the human metabolism. And we don't want to get to a starvation point, again, which is why I'm not a big fan of prolonged fasting over 4 days, unless it's absolutely necessary, medically speaking. There are definitely times where that is appropriate, and that should be supervised by a professional. But our body actually will get more clever when we fast because it dips into the resources and it actually utilizes them, right? It's like the back of that closet you haven't cleaned in a couple of years, right? So when you've cleaned the whole house, you'll eventually get to the back corner of that closet. So same thing with our body and our cells, right? Once the body has taken care of like the circulating stuff, the stuff that's more recent, and we've had cellular turnover, then we go into and actually start doing more cellular repair. So this is where we start seeing revision of scars, tissue improvement, skin improvement, right? Those are long-term effects of time-restricted eating and even intermittent fasting. There's many different theories on how it works, but I will say it has so many health effects, including improved sensitivity to blood sugar, right? So re-regulating that insulin sensitivity, that blood sugar insulin curve, the glucagon hormone interaction between insulin and glucagon, protects against fatty liver, which I think is really interesting. And I do think in part it's because your body's releasing glucose stores from the livers more readily than if we're eating around the clock. Less pancreatic fat, so actually less fat around or abdominal organs, or less visceral fat as a whole. And again, increased secretion of insulin causes inflammation in and of itself. And I definitely see a lot of people where their A1C may be looking fine at 5.5 or even lower at 5.4. I had one patient with a relatively normal A1C of 5.4, but I had this instinct to check his insulin, and his insulin was 134 fasting. That is a really high insulin. The reference range, I think, is even a little bit high. Ideal insulin levels, I would say, are between 5 and maybe even 10. Above that, we're starting to see very slight signs of insulin resistance. So don't let your A1Cs fool you. Make sure you get a comprehensive picture. Intermittent fasting, time-restricted feeding, I use this a lot in my metabolic patients, but even in just people who are trying to optimize, and this is where biohacking comes in, right? And even with hormones. So I'm going to back up a little bit because I want to highlight a little bit how intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding more appropriately impacts your hormones. So as women, we cycle. I hope you know this by now. So throughout our menstrual cycle, during the follicular phase, we're generally more resilient to things that are stressing our body. And this is not just the stress that we assume socially, but anytime I say stress, this can be dietary stress, this could be psycho-emotional stress, this could be infection stress. But in this case, we're talking about time-restricted feeding or a smaller feeding window. We're much more easily able to adapt to expanded fasting windows. So this might be the day or the part of the cycle where you are choosing to skip a day and do more of an intermittent fasting. Might skip 1 or 2 days of that week, and it's usually not consecutive days. So with time-restricted feeding, this is where maybe during the follicular phase, we can actually have a longer window of abstinence from food. So we're fasting a little bit longer overnight, and maybe we can get to that 14 hours, 16 hours. I generally wouldn't push it past the 16-hour mark. 14 seems to be a sweet spot for a lot of my patients where they feel really, really good. And then once we get into the luteal phase, that first week post-ovulation, again, we're still a little bit more stress resilient, but we're starting to shift more into a space where we're not as stress adapted. And so we should decrease our fasting window at that point in time and start going from, the 14 to 16 hours to 12 to 14 hours. And then the week premenstrually, this is the 1 week where a lot of us are actually experiencing PMS type symptoms. We're more irritable, maybe more tired, just a little bit more off. And that's actually the week where we adapt less well to stress in general. And that's all stressors, including intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding. So I would not skip days of food intake during this time because that can really send you for a roller coaster. And fasting, I would keep to 12 hours and not much more. Now, for some people, when we wake up, we're just absolutely not hungry. And I know there's going to be some people out here who say, well, that means you have low blood sugar. Well, maybe, or we actually have adequate amounts of blood sugar, and there are personalized ways to find that out. And I believe in personalized medicine because everybody's body functions differently. But on average, 12-hour, 13-hour fast, depending on how you're feeling that day, may be okay. Depends on when you've had dinner. Now, let's look at this a little bit closer. So when I say time restricted feeding, or intermittent fasting, as again is a misnomer in culture here, a lot of people will skip breakfast. So we'll actually have coffee first thing in the morning, do something like a bulletproof high butter coffee, which technically is actually breaking the fast. It is giving body input. So from a gastrointestinal perspective, you've broken your fast if you put butter or oils into your coffee, and even coffee is technically breaking your fast. It is stimulating digestive secretions and may start the blood sugar release from the liver. I don't want to get too technical here, so we'll stop it right there. Once people wake up, they have their coffee with whatever ingredients in it, and then skipping breakfast and not eating anything till noon or 1 o'clock. Okay, so what I see here is our body's circadian rhythm, our internal clock becomes more, or our body becomes more insulin resistant on average after 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, depending on the person. So this is from an evolutionary perspective, what I explain to my patients. If we have not been able to adequately meet our nutrient intake in the first half of the day, that must mean we're in a famine, right? Food is scarce, and therefore now we need to take the nutrients we put in our system and we need to put them away for storage as much as we can. So not only are you more hungry, your cortisol is higher because you have a higher drive to go get food, go on the hunt, right? We need to go find food, tank's empty. So we have the cortisol that's elevated, and now we have food coming in, and you're eating in a fight or flight state. So that may or may not be great for your digestion, but your body's also going to pack away the fuel. Regardless of what you're eating, we can take protein and convert it into glucose through gluconeogenesis in the body. So even if you're not eating any carbs, you may still be able to convert to carbs and or fats and store that. So I see a lot of insulin resistance happening in people who are doing this intermittent fasting and unfortunately eating only in the insulin resistant time frame. I even have patients who are only eating one meal a day and it happens to be dinner, and now we're eating it really late at 8 o'clock. So the level of insulin resistance that's being perpetuated by that dietary pattern is not conducive to a good metabolic health. Some people definitely lose weight, and that's usually because there is a caloric restriction, and that weight loss eventually ends up plateauing. And I've definitely had patients who've then ended up gaining weight, and I've seen blood sugar, like A1Cs, go up with this dietary pattern, which is definitely very fascinating and opposite of what we would have expected. Now, what I generally would recommend my patients do is, from a circadian rhythm standpoint, we don't want to eat within about 60 to 90 minutes of waking. And that means no coffee, nothing, water. Just have some lovely water, maybe some warm water, because our body is still waking up. We're taking out the trash. We're hopefully going to the bathroom, especially if you drank that warm glass of water that should have stimulated your bowels. You're cleaning house. Your body is waking up, your organs are waking up, everything's getting ready. And then if we have breakfast, so within like maybe that 90 minutes, 2 hours, let's say 2 hours of eating seems to be pretty fair. We want that food intake, that nutrient intake. We want to eat about 80% of our nutrients. I'm not saying calories here, I'm saying nutrients. I don't look at calories very much because calories doesn't equate nutrients, but nutrients equates health. right? So the more micronutrients we take in, the more building blocks our body has to utilize. So I always like to focus on nutrients. So 80% of our nutrients should be taken in before that 2 o'clock period. That's signaling to our body we are abundant. We are really abundant. There's lots of food available. We don't need to put this into storage. You're also not in your insulin resistant period. And so if you're starting off your day with a nutrient dense meal that is, high in healthy fats, moderate in protein, and some complex carbs, it's going to set you up for a much more even keeled blood sugar throughout your day. And then if you're hungry, obviously, please eat lunch and dinner. So here's the thing, and this is why I'm stopping, because I find that some people, when they have one of these really nutrient dense breakfasts, they're not actually hungry for lunch. They're still full. And so they end up having something like a dinner, and they're only eating 2 times a day. And that works for their physiology. Again, everybody's different. Some people do really well naturally with just 2 meals a day, and other people do great with 3 meals a day. And we'll talk about this 5 meals a day thing in a minute, because I think it's really important to touch on. So the ideal way to structure your nutrients throughout the day is eat breakfast like a king, eat lunch like a queen, and dinner like a pauper. Because in the evening hours, we should have already had 80% of our nutrients, so there shouldn't be a whole lot left that we need to fill up, but you're getting ready to wind down and go to bed. And if you're really, really hungry and it's really late, you've stayed up too late. Your body has relaunched cortisol and it's dumping glucose from the liver to keep you up. Because obviously now we need to go hunt, or there's something scary happening, because why else would you be awake? So that also ties into blood sugar regulation. Now with this 12-hour window, right? So, and this is where it may not work out ideally in some scenarios the week premenstrually. For me, I like to have an earlier dinner because I want to feel clean and empty by the time I go to bed. I want to make sure things have been mostly digested by the time you lay down. And really, you should have dinner 3 hours before laying down to prevent things like heartburn, but also make sure that your body's had time to complete everything it needs to do in the pre-digestion, like in the stomach and the small intestine, and that you're really able to do a lot of housekeeping and cleaning up at nighttime. So if you're having dinner, say 5:30, 6 o'clock, and a 12-hour window then would mean eat breakfast by 6, I'm going to look at you cross if you're going to make me eat at 6 a.m. I just woke up at 5:30. I do not want food in my system that early. So again, this is where in some scenarios, some people's physiologies are slightly different. And so if you're not hungry and your nutrient, if you feel full, not because your stomach is still full, but there's actually no need to get food, then maybe a 14-hour fast is still appropriate. But listen to your body and definitely don't push it to the 16-hour mark, because now you are creating that stress. But I want to make sure that you honor your body and your bio-individuality. Some people may wake up and they may be hungry, and then we say like, okay, hey, Dr. Kapersky, you said don't eat anything within the first 90 minutes of waking up. How do we do this? And don't eat really late. Again, this is where we take a really personalized approach to your dietary intake and your lifestyle and say what works for you. And if you're one of those patients that don't feed me food first thing in the morning and your blood sugar is not dysregulated, then maybe we go a little bit longer and maybe you're differently adapted. And honestly, if you have really great adrenal function, maybe it's not stressing our hormones as much as we see in the literature, what we're discovering right now. We can fast a little bit more during the follicular phase, and we can fast a little bit less or less well the week premenstrually. So really take that into consideration, especially if you're planning, a day of or 2 days where you may want to do something like a juice cleanse. Don't do that the week before your menstrual cycle. That's really, really stressful to your body. Now, from a blood sugar perspective, I want to discuss briefly the eating 5 meals a day thing. I know I'm going to get a little bit of kickback from some dietitians and nutritionists and doctors, because I know we've taught people to stabilize your blood sugar, you need to eat every 2 to 3 hours, and that holds true in some few cases. Honestly, I see this contributing more to insulin resistance and blood sugar dysregulation. I actually did that to me personally. I had this recommendation from an amazing doctor who suggested You should definitely eat every 2 to 3 hours to, stay more in the parasympathetic system. And I get it from a fight or flight perspective. That definitely held true and that made sense. But man, did I develop some blood sugar dysregulation. And I had never experienced that before. I was always the person that was fine if I ever skipped a meal. It was very easy to adapt to, not really lack of nutrient intake, but, like life gets busy and we skip lunch and we're fine. And it got me to the point where I was eating every 2 to 3 hours. And if I missed that 2 hour mark, that 2.5 hour mark, I could tell my blood sugar was crashing and I was feeling in a crisis mode. And then the rescue then would be more food. So what happens is we eat food, we create glucose, or we release glucose into the bloodstream, we secrete insulin to help us take the glucose and put it away. That's great. Now, it takes time for our body to do that. And if we keep putting food and glucose in, insulin just keeps going up because it doesn't have time to fully go down. And we're creating really this insulin resistance because, again, we're still putting the blood sugar away from the previous time. I mean, there's a reason we do oral glucose tolerance test over such a prolonged period of time. And so things are just normalizing and you're putting more food in. Insulin hasn't even gotten down to its complete baseline, but the glucose is coming down and starting to normalize, so which is great. But then you put more food on top of that, and so you're spiking the glucose again, and it may be crashing depending on what you eat because insulin now overshot, and so you're creating this perpetual curve of insulin going up, 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 and then as it comes down or crashes, you're going to require more food, and it's actually creating less stability in the long run. Now, again, there are some instances where people really do need to eat every 2 to 3 hours, so if that is you, please make sure you're doing that. If you are eating every 2 to 3 hours because it's been recommended to you, talk about these patterns with your doctor. But really, from a migrating motor complex standpoint, which is the mechanism that helps us empty our small intestines, right, that moves everything along in our GI tract, we really want an eating window of 3, ideally 4 hours, because that's when the body sends the signals to sweep out, right? Like, hopefully you're sweeping your kitchen a couple times a week and not just once a month. Same thing for our intestines. If we're eating every 2 to 3 hours, our intestines are never truly empty. They never get to do their cleaning. And so now food is constantly in your stomach, and then most people are eating late in the evening, maybe have a snack, a glass of wine before bed. By the way, that actually still counts within your eating window, that glass of wine or that cocktail that you're having right before bed. And so just make sure you're mindful of that. So from a gastrointestinal perspective, if we're constantly putting food through the tube and it can never truly clean itself, we're eventually going to end up with dysfunction. And whether that contributes to things like constipation, diarrhea, IBS, gas, bloating, there's a lot of avenues this can go. So just something to take into consideration there. So generally, I recommend my patients eat at least 2 to 3 meals per day, and not 2 as in a caloric restriction, 2 meals, but rather, if you're not hungry, I'm not going to force you to eat, especially if you're eating a highly nutrient-dense diet. And I've done a lot of experiments on myself because, hey, we're all N of 1, and I like to learn and I like to experiment on what works for me and how things feel. So I can come from a personalized perspective when we have that conversation. And all of our bodies are different. So let's kind of talk about it, because even though all of our bodies are slightly different, there is going to be some overlap in how we feel and what happens. And, it's like for me, when I was transitioning out of eating every 2 to 3 hours, it was a little rough. It did not feel great. I was feeling hypoglycemic and a little shaky. But then when I shifted my dietary patterns into eating a much larger breakfast that is much more nutrient dense, more healthy fats, that really made a huge difference. And I just noticed one day, it's like, oh wait, I'm really not hungry, and I noticed it's lunchtime. I'm going to wait another hour until my body gives me the signal to actually put fuel in. And this is where intuitive eating comes in. And I talked to a patient today, actually. It was really interesting. She was one of those patients I was told to eat every 2 to 3 hours to regulate her blood sugar. And she mentioned to me that her blood sugar dysregulation just keeps getting worse and she can't understand why. So we had that conversation, and she was like, oh, well, that makes sense, because I'm actually not hungry. I'm forcing myself to eat. If you're forcing yourself to eat, I mean, maybe you need a digestive enzyme because things are not moving down, but that's your body saying we don't need more nutrients necessarily, or maybe not those kind of nutrients. And your body sends very clear signals. So once I started practicing a little bit more intuitive eating within this time restricted feeding window, my body started to function a lot better. And I've noticed that it's even improved my level of inflammation. And I'm not really even consciously doing it anymore. I'm just really listening to my body. Now, I'm a big believer in the 80-20 rule, especially when it comes to health. If I'm invited to my neighborhood barbecue, and I love my neighbors, it's such a beautiful event to go hang out with them poolside. We barbecue. It's lovely. And dinner gets a little bit later. Even if we eat at 9 o'clock, I don't care. I'm not going to say, oh, I'm sorry, I do time restricted eating and I can't eat after 6 o'clock. Sorry. I choose to take a liberal approach with that because, again, I think we're here to enjoy our lives, and the benefit of the social, the community aspect of hanging with my friends and my neighbors, I think outweighs any damage, air quotes, you can't see those, but any potential deleterious effects that having one late dinner would have. Yes, I might not sleep as well. Okay, so yeah, if we have late dinners before bed and it's not been quite 3 hours, things haven't fully moved through, you're not going to sleep as well. It's going to disturb your sleep. Okay, one night is fine. And again, 80-20 rule, because we gotta live a little bit. Enjoy your life. Don't overthink it. Sometimes the stress of trying to do things perfectly outweighs the benefits you would have gotten from doing it perfectly. Stress really, yeah. There's so many avenues stress can affect you, from your adrenal health to your hormones to your blood sugar regulation to your weight to your cognitive function. When stress is that high, just let it go. So beyond just the improvements on health in regards to autophagy, lowering inflammation, gut health, blood sugar regulation, we're seeing improved things like lipid levels, and cholesterol panels or elevated levels of cholesterol generally are a sign of inflammation depending on which one, but specifically LDL, if that's elevated, that can be an inflammatory marker. Triglycerides that are elevated can be a sign of excess carbohydrate intake, actually. Fun fact, so make sure if your trigs are high, there might be too many carbs or sugar in your dietary intake. But we're seeing all of these normalize. So we're seeing improved body weight, fat mass, blood sugar regulation, insulin resistance, impaired beta cell function, which is your pancreatic cells that release insulin, improved fatty acid oxidation, liver fat, so less fat around the liver, decreased oxidative stress, lower blood pressure, and improved sleep quality. So these are all things that we're seeing in patients that are doing time restricted feeding, which is absolutely incredible. And that doesn't include taking a single supplement. So again, I've worked with patients who didn't want to or couldn't afford to take supplementation, and there's so many low-hanging fruit, and these are your diet and lifestyle changes. So again, let's make these dietary changes a pattern that supports our health, and take a look at why you want to do it. If you're doing it just to lose weight, to get your bikini body, it's probably not sustainable, nor is it the right reason. If you're doing it from an inflammatory perspective, a longevity, a health perspective, that's a lot more motivation to really love yourself and take good care of your body as best as you can, and you're loving yourself by providing nutrients to your body at the right time and in the right cadence. So again, this is not medical advice because I'm not your doctor. If you want me to be your doctor, check the caption below, or if you're on my Instagram profile, go ahead and check the link tree because there are ways to work with me. If you're confused on where to go, just shoot me a message, DM me on Instagram at divine_woman_wellness, and I'll help you out get in the right direction. We can always do a 15-minute quick meeting where we can decide what is suitable for you. There are so many other factors that I want to talk about today, but it's already been quite the lengthy episode. If you are curious about any of the topics that I mentioned during this podcast and you want to hear more, please make sure you send me a DM or drop a comment on any of the posts that are associated with this episode, and I'll either just message you back if it's a quick answer, clarification, or maybe I'll even do a post or a full podcast. And if you ever know anybody that you think would be great to interview, I am looking to do a few interviews, so please connect me. I'm totally open to meeting beautiful humans who want to share wisdom with all you lovely people. Okay, so for today, I think we're going to wrap it up. I think this was such an important episode because I talked to I talked to all of my patients about this topic, and even my neighbors. Wendy, if you're listening, oh my gosh, I had such a beautiful conversation with you today. One of my amazing neighbors I ran into, and we just struck up this fabulous, beautiful conversation that sparked so much joy within me. And we talked a little bit about time-restricted feeding, intermittent fasting, and yes, as our puppies played. So it was such a lovely day. Now, if you love this podcast, make sure you rate and review and share if you feel called to. Make sure you tag me if you share anything about my episodes here, the Divine Woman Wellness Podcast. I would love it if you could tag me so I can give you a shout out as well. And I'm just feeling so much love, and I'm loving doing this podcast, bringing you information and just being here with you. So I look forward to recording these every week, and I can't wait to get some of the other episodes out for you. And just a reminder, I am still working on my gut and hormone course for you, but if you're interested in it, I do have the wait list up in my link tree, so make sure you go ahead and sign up there. And if you have any questions, just reach out to me. I'm available. All right, for today, my loves, I'm gonna say it's a wrap, and I can't wait to record next week's episode. Have a beautiful day. Much love. Ciao.